Hey everyone, Jill Mathis here with another video for Photography Concentrate. I recently put out the query to some folks asking what subject would be the most useful for the next video. And one of the new members in the Facebook Mastermind group, Wendy, sent me this message. She says, maybe it seems basic and you just naturally know what to do, but I have to really think about it to achieve the type of shot I want. Maybe a video more on the aperture and the shutter speed and the effects you achieve by changing each. One of the things I liked most about this message was that Wendy didn't just ask, so how do I stop motion? She specifically wrote that she has to really think about it to get the shot she wants. And right there, that is a world of difference. I just can't say it enough how important it is to be intentional each and every time you raise your camera to your eye and stop and think about the effect you want to achieve. A deep and basic understanding of the relationship between aperture and shutter speed is fundamental to being more than just a technically proficient photographer. Too many people have these sort of mental cheat sheets in their head. They see a landscape and immediately set the aperture to f/22 or whatever and shoot. No questions asked. Or they find themselves in front of a river and drop the shutter speed to half a second. Click and move on. Another reason to spend time understanding these basics is to move on from using program mode, which so many people rely on. You'll never advance as a photographer if you depend solely on the camera to make the big decisions. When I first started shooting, you had to learn the basics in a way that it did all become natural. Otherwise, you were not only wasting money by randomly setting your f-stop and shutter speed and hoping for the best, you were also wasting a lot of time since you had to go and develop that roll of $4 film before you could see if your guesses had paid off. Today, with digital cameras, you can, in theory, just snap 100 shots and hope you like one of them. So, while this video is basically just going to cover the first principles, the foundation, it's dedicated to all of those who want to be thinking photographers and not just photography robots. So let's start with just having a look at apertures, all on their own, not in relation to shutter speeds just yet. Now, while all your settings make a difference in each photo, in many cases the aperture has the biggest impact. For the things I photograph and the way I personally shoot, the aperture is what I set first. To put it technically, the aperture refers to the lens's diaphragm. Now, since I've rarely used anything but Leica rangefinders and their mechanical lenses, it makes it easy to actually see the diaphragm move as you change, as in my case, from f1.4 to f16. With the more common electronic lenses, the f-stop or aperture is communicated electronically and you don't actually see the diaphragm in the lens. The easiest way I have found to explain aperture is to think of the mechanics in relation to how your eye works. How many of you have been outside and looked off in the distance and squinted your eyes to see better? What you're doing is shutting down or stopping down the amount of light that is getting to your pupil, so it becomes a little easier for you to see because less light is able to get into your eye. And as you know, your pupil also is shutting down and getting smaller, allowing less light in, just like your lens. The inverse then is true in darker situations. Rarely do you squint in the dark, unless you've forgotten your glasses maybe, but instead open your eyes wide to let more light in, as does your pupil, becoming wide open. Now, there's more going on than just how much light is getting in. Stopping down the higher number or opening up the lower number also changes the depth of field, but we'll get to that. Let's stick to the eye analogy for another minute but now in relation to shutter speed. Just remember, though it may seem odd at first, that the smaller the focal number, the f-stop, the F stands for focal, the bigger the opening. And the bigger the focal number, the smaller the opening. As you can imagine, a wide open lens, let's say here in my f1.4, is going to allow the maximum amount of light into your camera. While stopping down, such as to f16, which is just a tiny opening, is going to let just a little bit of light in. Your shutter speed is sort of like your eyelid, which is sort of like your eye's shutter. And just like your eyelid, which can stay open for short periods or long periods, so does the shutter in the camera work. Leaving your shutter open for longer, such as 1/60th of a second, lets more light in, and vice versa when you shoot faster at, say, 1/2000th of a second. So keeping all that in mind, let's just take the next step. You can see that if you're stopped down at f16 and letting very little light in through the lens, you're going to have to leave the shutter open longer, which translates to slowing down your shutter speed to compensate. Whereas if you have your aperture set at f1.4, letting as much light in as possible, then you're going to have to balance the light getting in by keeping the shutter open for less time in normal situations. Now let's talk about the second role your lens plays, which is how changing the aperture affects your field of vision, or in other words, what stays in focus in front of and behind your subject. I know that the Japanese term bokeh has come into fashion, but for this video, we're going to stay old school and use the term depth of field. I'm pretty sure we don't want to necessarily go into the laws of physics and optics to understand the how aperture affects the depth of field. So simply put, the smaller the number, the smaller your depth of field will be. Like this. And the larger the number, the greater your depth of field is, like this. So don't get hung up on remembering any formula. As with everything we do, from fixing your favorite meal to learning to drive a stick shift, to something as basic as learning to tie your shoes, practice not only makes perfect, but after enough times, makes everything second nature. My advice is to sit down with your camera on a tripod by yourself and be thankful you're working in digital so you can immediately see the changes. When I started photographing back in the 80s, I did this exact same exercise, but then I had to go into the darkroom and develop the film and then print the contact sheet before I could actually see and subsequently grasp the whole story behind aperture settings. Now, when you have your camera set up, set out something you have laying around, like a glass or a bowl, and open your lens to the biggest aperture you have, whether it's f1.4 or 2 or f3.5. Take a light reading and set your shutter speed accordingly. Take one shot and then start shutting down your aperture. Now in my case, I would start with f1.4 and then go to f2 and then f2.8 and then f4 and so on. Now this is key. Remember, if you're starting wide open, as you shut down, you'll need to increase the amount of time your shutter is open to compensate for the decreased light from the aperture opening. Here I started at f1.4 and my shutter speed was 250. As I went to f2, then I went to shutter speed 125, and then at f2.8, I went to the shutter speed of 160, and so on. At this point, the next question I usually get goes something like this. So, I get the concept, but when should I use what f-stop? If you look on the internet, just about every photography site will give you your usual cheat sheets on when to use what aperture. They'll say things like, for portraits, use f5.6, or for landscapes, always use f22. But for me, for one thing, that is just too much to remember, and who wants to be pulling out some sort of notepad every time you're out photographing? In another video, I talked a little bit about how I determine what f-stop I'm going to use, but also at times what shutter speed. Since for my commercial work, I mainly shoot inanimate objects in chaotic factories, I keep my lens at f1.4 to reduce the background clutter and noise, and I adjust the shutter speed as needed. Since nothing really moves, I don't worry too much about slow shutter speeds. On the other hand, I did a year-long commission for UNESCO a while ago, and the main body of the work was landscapes in the northern part of Italy. For that project, I was shooting wide open spaces that showed the mountains in the distance and fields in the foreground. And since I wanted both of those elements in focus, I usually tried to keep my lens ready at f16. The director of the project also needed some images of this one particular breed of crane that were becoming scarce, and so when I went to the area where they were known to be, I concentrated then more on the shutter speed, since I knew the cranes would probably be moving. Now, unfortunately, so many of the cranes had disappeared that in that entire year of shooting, the only evidence I saw of them were old nests. Now, I'm mentioning all this to plant the seed that you don't need to follow the standard rules. You don't need cheat sheets. You decide and allow the scene and your own creativity dictate what settings to use. Move with intention and ask yourself some questions. For instance, do you have a subject in motion? Then you know you will have to have a faster shutter speed if you want to stop the action. Things like skiing or other fast action sports is probably going to have to start around 1/1000 or so. Instead, if you have someone just strolling by, you can do it a lot slower and start around 1/125th. But ask yourself, do you want that effect of stopping the action, or do you want to show some blur? That's where you, as a photographer, start to shine and start to use your mind and your creativity. Now, if you know you'll be shooting things that don't move too much, like landscapes or close-ups or even portraits, then look around the subject. Is the foreground or background relative to your shot? Does it add something, or does it detract from the harmony or balance in the frame? From there, make your aperture setting your first choice, stopping down the larger number to have more in focus throughout the frame, or opening up if you want to let everything besides your subject fall out of focus. Again, practice this stuff with your own equipment when you're on your own, and you have lots of time, so you'll be prepared when you're out shooting. Keep at it, and in no time you'll be wondering what all the fuss was about. Thanks for watching. Now get out there and start shooting.